now than when we started this war. And I thought oil prices would go to $200, $250. It's at $100 now. And I think you're surprised, and I'm surprised. But even if it went to 200, it would have been worth it. And I said, I hate to do this, but we have to make an excursion down to Iran because we can't let them have a nuclear weapon. Because as tough as they are, we want to keep them alive. We want to keep all of you alive. Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon, and they won't. And they've agreed to that, among other things.
President Trump in the Oval Office yesterday, flanked by UFC fighters, defending the rising costs Americans are paying as a result of his war with Iran. Meanwhile, he continues to insist there have been very good talks with Iran, but it's not clear if the new regime is ready to end this conflict. In fact, they seem to indicate otherwise. We'll bring you the very latest. And speaking of the economic pain Americans are feeling, the national average for a gallon of gas is over $4.50. And the White House economic advisor yesterday bragged about the way consumers are paying for fuel. Democrats now pouncing on those comments. We'll explain that. Plus, we're following everything coming out of the Vatican this morning as Secretary of State Marco Rubio meets with Pope Leo amid President Trump's continuous criticism of the pontiff. And good morning and welcome to Morning Joe. It is Thursday, May 7th. With us, we have the co-host of our 9 a.m. hour, staff writer at The Atlantic, Jonathan Lemire. Former spokesperson for the U.S. mission to the United Nations, Hagar Shamali. She also worked at the National Security Council and the Treasury Department. MS Now senior national security reporter David Rode. Columnist and associate editor at The Washington Post, David Ignatius. And CEO and co-founder of Axios, Jim VandeHei. Great group to start off this Thursday morning. We're going to get back to the latest back and forth between President Trump and Iranian officials in just a moment. But first, one of the big fallouts from the war continues to be rising fuel prices, particularly jet fuel. We're now learning the Trump administration and Republican officials are privately concerned about the political fallout from those increases. The Wall Street Journal reports former New Hampshire Governor Chris Sununu, now the president of the industry group Airlines for America, visited Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent recently to deliver the warning that airfares will only surge if the war in Iran does not end soon. Shipping traffic, though, through the Strait of Hormuz remains at a standstill. Sununu told the Journal he believes the Trump administration wants to wrap up the war, but that, quote, ticket prices won't go down immediately. He went on to say that prices will likely remain elevated through the fall. We've already seen the impact of higher fuel prices play out for Spirit Airlines, which recently began court proceedings after filing for bankruptcy. Other low-cost carriers like Frontier face similar challenges. And new polling shows the impact this is having with voters. The latest NPR-PBS Marist poll finds 35% of Americans approve of Trump's handling of the economy, a top issue for voters. One factor is the rising cost of gas. 63% say they blame President Trump a great deal or a good amount for the current increase in prices at the pump. Overall, just 37% approve of the job Trump is doing compared to 59% who disapprove. That is Trump's highest disapproval rating ever recorded by Marist throughout both of his terms. And if the 2026 midterms were held today, the poll shows 52% of voters would cast a ballot for the Democratic congressional candidate versus 42% who would choose a Republican. So we go from the global look at what's happening with the war to how it is playing with American voters. Jim VandeHei, what does this tell us in terms of the politics of the war in Iran? And also, it seems like every day there's a new update on the war in Iran that doesn't really pan out. Americans' trust in this administration's ability to lead and tell the truth.
Yeah, I mean, those poll numbers are bad. There's no way to sugarcoat it if you're a Republican. It's hard to go below 35% in polling in American politics, because the base of the party in power always kind of has at least that 35% support. It's kind of red meat. It's real, most passionate voters. And listen, like, it's great. Trump is right. If you're in the stock market, you're rich. It's a good time to be alive. You're making a lot of money. The market keeps surging. You're getting involved in some of these secondary deals in these AI companies that are booming. That's not most Americans. Most Americans aren't sitting there with big stock portfolios. Most Americans don't have highly lucrative 401k plans. They have cash and they have things they need to spend it on, and they spend a lot of it on gas, and they spend the extra money that they have to go on a trip using an airplane or a car. And so those things really hurt. And that's the reason that every election we ever have is usually about the economy. And there's a sour mood, and that manifests itself in that generic poll you showed where Democrats are beating Republicans quite convincingly. It's why Republicans think they'll lose the House and think they might lose the Senate. That's a bad place to be. And it doesn't seem like there's an easy way out of this for the president. There's not. He so desperately wants to say the war's over, that they have a deal, that the Iranians have agreed to everything. And I think it has been some progress behind the scenes. David Ignatius can talk more thoroughly about that than I can, but no one thinks this is going to end anytime soon. And even when you do, the downstream effects are already cooked in. Those gas prices are not coming down significantly anytime soon.
And we'll get to David Ignatius on that point in just a moment. You also mentioned Americans and their cash flow. White House economic advisor Kevin Hassett is getting a lot of attention online for comments he made yesterday on Fox Business. Take a look.
And so the consumer is really firing on all cylinders, just like the corporate sector you're seeing in the earnings reports. And they're doing that because they have so much more money in their pockets. In fact, I had the head of one of the big 5 banks in my office yesterday going through the credit card data. And just as Secretary Bessent said, credit card spending is through the roof. They're spending more on gasoline, but they're spending more on everything else, too.
No, they don't have more money in their pockets. That's just not true. Just like the president saying affordability is a joke. This is a complete disconnect between the administration and the American people, and the administration's view of maybe how their lives are going and how their friends' lives are going and how the American people are living every single day. And it is impossible for them not to notice they're not doing very well, and everything is much more expensive. Can't buy a home, can't get health care, can't afford their health care, can't get to their health care, to access that health care because the rural hospitals have been closed, because certain departments or divisions within hospitals have been closed, because certain doctors are afraid to do life-saving treatments. It goes on and on and on. And several Democratic lawmakers responded to a part of that clip. Senator Bernie Sanders wrote, Americans forced to put more of their spending on credit cards because of outrageously high prices. That's a win for big banks. It's a disaster for working people. And Senator Elizabeth Warren said the Trump administration is raising your costs and celebrating it on live TV. Meanwhile, Pod Save America host Jon Favreau joked, we must consider the possibility that Kevin Hassett is secretly working for the Democrats. Politically, I guess, a win, but nobody wants to see the American people suffering, Jonathan Lemire.
No, that's exactly right. I mean, Trump administration billionaire friends, they're doing well. Plenty of corporations are doing well. The stock market's doing well. The president, we know he views the health of the economy by the stock market, but that's not how most Americans feel. And the prices are high, and they're certainly at the gas pump. We're seeing airfare, but in many other walks of life as well. And this is why so many Republicans, even just a couple of Republicans were critical of Hassett yesterday. Justin Amash said so, that this is, others were, this is just disconnected from reality. And it's not going away anytime soon. And we're seeing that tweet there. That's what I think privately many around Trump do realize, that even if this war were to end tomorrow, which it likely will not, the high prices are going to persist for a long time. And that is just toxic for the GOP heading into November's midterm. So as for the war, the United States and Iran continue to give mixed messages about potential negotiations to end it. President Trump yesterday once again insisted Iran wants to make a deal, saying the two sides have had, in his words, very good talks this week, while also threatening the possibility of more attacks. Iran's foreign ministry, meanwhile, says the country is considering a U.S. plan to conclude the conflict, while earlier yesterday, an Iranian lawmaker dismissed it as an American wish list. Axios is reporting that the Memorandum of Understanding would declare an end to the war in the region and the start of a 30-day period of negotiations on a detailed agreement to open the strait, limit Iran's nuclear program, and lift U.S. sanctions. Now, MS Now has not confirmed that original reporting from Axios, but a Pakistani official linked with mediating talks between the U.S. and Iran tells our contributor, Inzamam Rashid, that the prospect of a proposal to end the war is very likely in the coming days. At the same time, U.S. Central Command says U.S. forces yesterday fired on an Iranian oil tanker in the Gulf of Oman after the ship sailed toward an Iranian port in what it calls a violation of the American blockade. So, David Ignatius, help us sift through this. There have been a number of times during this conflict where Trump has declared it almost over. He's also declared victory more times than I can count. The Pakistanis, who, they're trying their best, but they've been relentlessly optimistic throughout all of this. And some of that optimism has not borne fruit. And even yesterday, we had more from leaders from Tehran really push back against the reports that a deal was close. So maybe there'll be some negotiations in the days ahead. But tell us what you know. Has any progress actually been made to bring this war to a close?
So, Jonathan, I can confirm the Axios reporting that there is a basic framework, memorandum that would be exchanged by the two sides, and then followed by a 30-day period of negotiation on the details, the details of limiting Iranian enrichment, banning it outright for 12 to 15 years, other limits, a gradual process for reopening the Strait of Hormuz, a declaration of an end of the state of war in the region, which would mean that the U.S. forces adjacent to Iran would pull back and that Iranian proxies would be limited in some new ways that aren't specified. The problem with this outline is that it's just that. If you have the sense with President Trump that he's sort of like a boat tacking to windward. He goes this way and that way and this way, and he's making gradual progress toward the deal he wants, but it takes a long time and there are constant reversals. That's what this negotiation is like. One thing that I've learned that really is interesting is that the administration's negotiations, although they're still working with the Pakistani mediators and the kind of formal line of negotiation that they began 3 weeks ago, have also been working back channels, trying to contact new people within the IRGC, the Iranian hardline group, in the hopes of pulling people away and encouraging them to think that there's a different path for the country. Whether that will bear fruit, it should be clear in the next 24 to 48 hours. But the details of a possible plan are pretty far along. And I think it's a question of whether there is the political will in Iran to embrace this deal. There's a lot in it for them in terms of ending the war, but also in terms of getting billions of dollars in frozen assets back to them. I think that the final thing to say about this is President Trump's willingness to contemplate a deal that's well short of the goals that he originally set when he talked about unconditional surrender shows you just how strong the economic and now political pressures on him are to make a deal. He clearly wants one to the point that he pulled back from his Project Freedom blockade plan 2 days ago in the hopes that this package that I'm describing might land. But we're still, as I say, a day or two from knowing whether this is real or another feint that's going to disappear because of misunderstandings on both sides.
And David Rode, we've certainly learned to be skeptical every time the president voices optimism that a deal is close. And let's be clear, even if this were to open, it's a 30-day period for the Strait of Hormuz would still likely be closed during that. That would, the economic fallout there would be significant. So David Ignatius makes a great point that of the administration's original goals of the war, yes, they decimated the Iranian Navy, but everything else, they have fallen short. So President Trump, who hates the idea of being anything else than a clear-cut winner, would likely have to compromise those goals in order to take this deal. And also, he's not wrong that it's hard to know who to talk to in Tehran right now because their leadership is so fractured.
So I want to credit, I think there's people around the president who are working really hard to, make this happen. The Pakistanis are trying very hard, as you do, as you said. I just think flat out this, I just want to call it a 30-day, one-page agreement.
Yeah.
Is a win for Iran.
Yes.
It's a huge win. They have stood up to the United States and linked. We can talk about that in more detail. B, I keep getting told that the Israeli officials are saying there's deep divides inside the Iranian government, but American officials are telling me that that's not true, that the IRGC is in firmer control than they were before the war, and one congressional official just called it a military dictatorship. And I fear that this pursuit of somehow moderates or other people is not really there. It's that they're being told these things, the administration, and they believe it. So I just am. And lastly, this one-page agreement is not a peace deal. This is not a peace deal. This is an extension of a ceasefire that several weeks ago the president said there was no end of the ceasefire. The president keeps capitulating. He said before, this is several weeks ago. He's like, we have a ceasefire for 2 weeks.
Right.
And when that ends, he's like, actually, the ceasefire will continue with no end date. And then the pivotal thing was this Project Freedom to open the Strait of Hormuz by force. That was the most aggressive, I think, and the most effective move by the U.S. military. It worked. And then he calls it off after 24 hours. And so that's, again, a huge win for Iran. So this is not a peace agreement.
I want to ask you about that, Hagar, but first, China is stepping into a more prominent diplomatic role in the Iran conflict just days before President Trump meets Chinese President Xi Jinping in Beijing. Yesterday, Iran's foreign minister traveled to China for high-level talks, signaling closer coordination between Tehran and Beijing. Following the meeting, the Chinese foreign minister called for a comprehensive ceasefire and urged quick action to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. It comes as the Trump administration has been openly pressing China to use its influence over Tehran to ease tensions and lift Iran's effective chokehold on the strait. You can comment on that, but also to David Rhodes' point, it seems like the president's messaging doesn't instill confidence. Is it safe to say it doesn't also sometimes match the reality on the ground? And these moment-to-moment updates that get undermined by Iran shows sort of little control over the situation. Your thoughts?
Yeah. So first, to close the point on China, because China's a really important one. And I would follow that one closely through next week because you have the Beijing summit that's taking place on May 14th. President Trump is going there, and both sides want to see the strait open by the time that summit happens. Otherwise, the summit itself might not go so well. Right. And that's because the U.S. is pressuring China and saying, we don't want to see you buying sanctioned Iranian oil. And China has just told its refineries to ignore that call. So it's a very tense moment, and they both want it to be successful. To your point, and David, and both Davids, actually. The points from both Davids were very important. I love that you mentioned the point about Project Freedom. This is such an important one. This was the U.S.'s effort to checkmate the Iranian regime. They said, we're going to go guide these vessels out of the Strait of Hormuz. And it was a checkmate. Why? Because they told the Iranian regime, if we can do this, then you don't have control over the strait. And if you attack, you're breaking the ceasefire and we're going to return to war. So what happened? The Iranian regime lobbed missiles in the strait and at the UAE, and we didn't return to war. Yes, we attacked one Iranian ship, but it didn't return to that. And the problem with that is that if Trump's bravado here, he's sent 50,000 troops to the region. If the U.S. doesn't appear as though it's willing to back up these statements with military action, then the Iranian regime looks at it as a significant point of weakness. So on one hand, yes, you have these efforts to one-up each other publicly, and you see Trump saying, yes, talks are going well, but I'm not. The latest thing is he said, I'm not going. We're not going to send people now to talks for the next round. We haven't set that yet because he's trying to do a negotiating tactic. Look like he's comfortable, look like he's willing to walk away. That's a classic negotiating tactic. But the fact is that if the U.S. doesn't appear like it's willing to use its military force, then that is, for the regime, a win.
All right. I want to ask David Ignatius after a break the big picture of this and what we've learned from history, particularly 1979, about not just China, but Iran and negotiating with Iran. Still ahead on Morning Joe, what we're learning this morning about a purported suicide note from convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein that's been unsealed by a judge. Plus, health officials are working to contain an outbreak of a deadly virus after several cruise ship passengers have been sickened. We'll have the latest on that. We'll also be joined by the Democrat looking to unseat Republican Governor Greg Abbott of Texas. And as we go to break, a quick look at the traveler's forecast this morning from AccuWeather's Bernie Rayno. Bernie, how's it look? A federal judge has made public a purported suicide note written by Jeffrey Epstein. The note was originally under seal in the criminal case of a former cellmate of the deceased sex offender. The letter dates to what was believed to be Epstein's unsuccessful suicide attempt in July of 2019. The handwritten note begins, quote, "They investigated me, found nothing." It also includes statements about choosing, quote, "one's time to say goodbye." It's important to note the letter's authenticity has not been confirmed. Epstein's cellmate told the New York Times that he discovered the note inside of a graphic novel after Epstein was found dead, hanging from a bunk bed in his cell in August of 2019. New York City's chief medical examiner determined Epstein died by suicide. The Justice Department did not comment on the note's release. Meanwhile, House Oversight Committee lawmakers questioned Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick for several hours yesterday during a closed-door interview on his ties to Jeffrey Epstein. It comes after Justice Department documents revealed Lutnick had misrepresented his relationship with the late sex offender. Lutnick has not been accused of any wrongdoing in connection to Epstein's crimes, but he previously claimed to have cut ties with Epstein after a meeting in 2005. In his opening statement, Lutnick said he met Epstein only 3 times, once for a tour of his home after they became neighbors, once again during an invitation to Epstein's Island in 2012, and once more to discuss a construction project on Epstein's New York City home that may have had impact on Lutnick's residence next door. After hours of questioning, Democrats told reporters Lutnick did not admit to misleading Americans about his ties to Epstein, with one congresswoman saying he repeatedly characterized their interactions as meaningless and inconsequential. So we'll continue to follow that. Turning back now to the war in Iran. David Ignatius, I wanted to ask, as we are watching these back and forths on the public stage between the president and Iran, we learned a lot about Iran in 1979 for sure, and China. And I'm curious what you hope the administration would take into consideration as they approach this war and the messaging around it and the reasons for it.
So, Mika, since the revolution in 1979, the United States has had a consistent problem, which is how to take this very destabilizing, very radical revolutionary movement and encourage it. Sanctions, offers of new trade opportunities. You remember during President Reagan's term, the secret mission to Tehran with one of our representatives carrying a cake to try to woo the Ayatollahs. Through all that time, there's been an attempt to draw Iran into a more stable, less revolutionary relationship. And President Trump has been trying to do that using military force and now diplomacy. The concern is that Iran basically has taken America's best punch militarily. We finally went to war against Iran, bombing them last year and then a sustained military campaign this year. And they're still standing, and they feel stronger and more confident. So the worry would be that rather than transforming the revolutionary regime, making it more moderate, more a part of the community of nations, this is reinforcing the hardline elements in Iran. So we'll have to see. Never want to prejudge the results of negotiations. But if you stand back, as you were inviting me to do, and look at the broad sweep of this story, you'd have to say that Iran has come through this war stronger in terms of its self-confidence, its belief that it can stand up to the United States than it was before. And that's a worry that we all need to have. This is a regime that has chanted for 47 years, death to Israel,
Right.
death to America. Has that really changed? And we don't know the answer yet.
Yeah, I think David Andrews is spot on there. So, Hagar, with that idea that Iran's come through with this perhaps in a stronger position and seems less willing to end the conflict, certainly less so than President Trump, who's desperate to make a deal. So what would it take? I know you spent a lot of time thinking about the region. What sort of agreement would it take, you think, to actually bring this war to some sort of close?
Well, to bring it to a close, I'm a big believer that you have to really threaten the military engagement, military force, in order to make the Iranian regime bend to your demands. But there's a difference between bringing it to a close and undermining the Iranian regime so that it doesn't continue its nefarious behavior. There are two things that I'm really concerned about. One is that if they get sanctions relief, which I'm just not sure how they're not going to at this stage, but if they get sanctions relief, then that's only going to repower them. And I understand that, and I believe the administration says it would take them years to rebuild their military. I understand that, except right now they're pursuing terrorist attacks in Europe through a terrorist group called Hayy. And that was very quick. It started right after the Iran war, and all of a sudden you had about 17 attacks across Europe, most recently in Golders Green, where 2 Jews were stabbed. So they're pursuing also these new tactics to say, you know what, we're not going to go down easily. We're going to find cheap and easy ways to terrorize everybody around the world. And if they have more money, that's only going to make it more easy. So I'm worried about that. You're going to have that. As long as the Iran regime stays in place, you're going to have that. So for what it takes, to answer your question about what it takes to end the war completely, is you got to, as we were just talking off air, speak softly and carry a big stick. But I don't see the administration being willing to wield that stick right now.
And right now, David, Iran is going to come out of this knowing they have more control over the Strait of Hormuz than they did going into the war. They know they can shut it, and they can see the impact that will have on the global economy. So explain to us, we've been talking about this offline a bunch the last day or two. Explain why it's so mystifying in your estimation that the U.S. abandoned Project Freedom to try to get ships through that strait.
There seems to be a concern in the Trump administration about too many American casualties. Other than that, that seems to be the main thing, and that this war will spread. They just grossly miscalculated in terms of Iran seizing control of the strait, which they should have known was coming. And then the whole reason that there's this power is the ability of Iran to hit refineries in the region. They hit one on the day of the start of this naval operation. But you have to push through that. The lesson in terms of American national security is that bravado alone, the tough talk, particularly of Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, and air power alone will not defeat America's enemies. You cannot, wage war in this tough talk, and I've said it many times, and I don't want a ground invasion. I don't want that. But don't go to war unless you're ready to use all the elements of military power that you have. And lastly, again, Secretary Hegseth is asking for $1.5 trillion in spending. And you mentioned cheap ways that the Iranians are pushing back with terror cells and these kind of things. The asymmetric warfare, the Shahed drone, is more effective than these multi-million-dollar weapon systems that the U.S. has. There's a Washington Post reporting, some CNN reporting about Iran hitting more than 250 targets on American military bases across the region. The Shahed drones are getting through. They cost a fraction of American military. So this huge spending on expensive razzle-dazzle systems doesn't protect the country. It's not necessarily the best way to protect the country, and I don't think, at least Defense Secretary Hegseth is being honest with the country. He has not admitted that this much damage has been done to all these bases. MS Now
senior national security reporter David Rode and former spokesperson for the U.S. mission to the United Nations, Hagar Shamali. Thank you both very much. And coming up, a look at how the Trump administration's sweeping immigration reform has impacted children. We'll have new reporting from ProPublica about the harm they allegedly endured throughout the ongoing deportation campaign. Morning Joe will be right back.